The morning bell echoed through the hallways of Westfield High, a seemingly ordinary school tucked away in the heart of a suburban town. To most, it was just another day. But for 16-year-old Jamal Anderson, it marked the start of a battle he never thought he'd face. Jamal wasn't the kind of kid to make waves. He was quiet, thoughtful, and deeply passionate about his studies and community. But in a school where the lines of fairness often blurred, Jamal found himself pushed into the spotlight, not by choice, but by necessity. It all began with something small, as it often does, a history project. The assignment was simple: pick a historical figure and explain their impact. Jamal, always eager to bring fresh perspectives, chose to research a local civil rights leader whose story was barely mentioned in textbooks. He poured his heart into the project, working late nights in the library and interviewing members of his community. When presentation day came, he stood proudly in front of his classmates, sharing the untold story with passion and clarity. But instead of the applause he hoped for, Jamal was met with silence, and then questions he wasn't prepared for. "Where did you even get that information?" his teacher, Mrs. Carter, asked, her tone sharp. "I've never heard of this person, and I'm not sure this aligns with the curriculum." Jamal stammered, confused by her response. I did my research," he said. "This is real history. I can show you my sources." But Mrs. Carter dismissed him with a wave of her hand. "We'll discuss this later." What Jamal didn't realize was that later would spiral into something much bigger than a classroom debate. Over the next few weeks, his project became a topic of contention among teachers, administrators, and even some students. Some praised Jamal for his dedication and bravery, while others accused him of being disruptive or trying to push an agenda. The whispers in the hallways grew louder, and soon Jamal found himself under a microscope. It wasn't just the project anymore. Suddenly, his every move seemed scrutinized. A late submission on a homework assignment, a meeting with the principal, a disagreement in class, a write-up. It felt as though the school was determined to make an example out of him. And yet, Jamal couldn't understand why. All he had done was try to share the truth. One day, as he sat alone in the cafeteria, staring at the unappetizing tray of food in front of him, a girl slid into the seat across from him. It was Maya Johnson, one of the few students who had openly defended him in class. Maya was bold, smart, and unapologetically herself, a force to be reckoned with. "You know they're trying to shut you up, right?" she said, leaning in close. Her voice was low, but her eyes burned with determination. Jamal looked up, startled. "What do you mean?" "They don't like what you're doing," Maya continued. "You're challenging the way things are around here. And people like Mrs. Carter, they don't want to deal with that. It's easier to silence you than to face the truth." Jamal's heart sank. He had suspected as much, but hearing someone else say it made it all too real. "What am I supposed to do?" he'd asked. "I'm just one person." Maya smirked. "One person can make a difference. You just have to decide if you're willing to fight." And that was the moment everything changed. Jamal decided he wasn't going to back down. With Maya's help, he started documenting every interaction, every unfair punishment, and every piece of evidence that showed the school's bias. Together, they uncovered a pattern that went far beyond his project, a system that seemed designed to suppress voices like his. But the deeper they dug, the more dangerous it became. Jamal began receiving anonymous messages, some warning him to stop, others outright threatening him. His parents were called into meetings where the administration painted him as a troublemaker. Friends he thought he could trust started avoiding him. It felt like the entire world was turning against him, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that he was on the verge of exposing something much bigger than himself. Late one night, as Jamal sat at his desk surrounded by papers and notes, his phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "Be careful. You don't know what you're getting into." Jamal stared at the screen, his pulse racing. He had no idea who had sent the message or what it meant, but one thing was clear. He was closer to the truth than ever before, and someone didn't want him to find it. What would you do if the system you trusted turned against you? If speaking up meant risking everything? Jamal's journey was far from over, and as the walls seemed to close in, he knew one thing for certain: he couldn't stop now. Stay tuned, because this story is just getting started. Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. Every time he glanced over his shoulder in the crowded hallways of Westfield High, he caught fragments of hushed conversations, quick glances, and a tension that seemed to hang in the air wherever he went. It was as if the entire school had become a stage, and he was the reluctant main character in a story he didn't ask to be a part of. But the question that haunted him most was simple: why? Why had his project triggered such a strong reaction? Why were so many people desperate to keep him quiet? Maya had her theories. The two of them spent hours after school in her tiny kitchen, the table piled high with folders, printouts, and Jamal's carefully written notes. "This isn't just about your project," she said one afternoon, her tone sharp with frustration. "It's about power. They're afraid of what happens when someone challenges the way things have always been." Jamal frowned, stirring the lukewarm tea she'd made him. "But I didn't do anything wrong. I just told the truth." "Exactly," Maya said, her eyes narrowing. "And sometimes the truth is the most dangerous thing you can say." It was a comforting thought, in a way, to believe that he was fighting for something bigger than himself. But as the days went on, Jamal couldn't help but feel the weight of the consequences pressing down on him. His grades, once immaculate, were starting to slip. Teachers who had once praised his work now seemed to go out of their way to criticize him, marking his essays harshly and docking points for things they would have overlooked in others. Even his track coach had pulled him aside after practice one day, warning him to stay focused if he wanted to keep his spot on the team. At home, things weren't much better. His parents, though supportive, were visibly worried. His mom, a nurse who worked long shifts at the local hospital, spent her rare moments at home, urging him to let it go. "Jamal, baby," she said one night, her voice heavy with exhaustion. "You've made your point. You're smart, and people know it. But this is taking over your life. You don't have to fight every battle." His dad was less direct but no less concerned. A quiet man who worked as a mechanic, he didn't say much, but Jamal noticed the way he lingered in the doorway of his room some nights, as if wanting to say something but not knowing how. "Just be careful," he'd mutter before leaving, the words more a plea than a command. Jamal wanted to listen to them. He wanted to drop it all, to go back to being just another kid trying to survive high school. But every time he thought about giving up, he remembered the faces of the people he'd interviewed for his project, the elderly women who had marched in protests decades ago, the middle-aged man who still carried scars from a police dog attack, the stories they had shared in trembling voices, trusting him to do them justice. How could he turn his back on them now? The threats only made things harder. At first, they were just cryptic messages sent to his phone, like the one he'd received that night at his desk, but soon they escalated. One morning, he found a piece of paper stuffed into his locker, the words "Keep your mouth shut" scrawled across it in red ink. Another time, as he walked home after school, a car slowed down beside him, its tinted windows rolled down just enough for someone to yell, "You're in over your head, kid," before speeding off. Maya was furious when he told her about it. "This is harassment," she said, pacing back and forth in her living room. "We need to report this." "To who?" Jamal shot back. "The principal. The same guy who called me disruptive in front of my parents. The same one who's been ignoring all of this." She stopped pacing, her fists clenched at her sides. "Then we go higher. The school board, the media. Someone has to care." But Jamal wasn't so sure. The more he thought about it, the more it felt like the system was rigged against him from the start. The school wasn't just ignoring him. It was actively trying to discredit him. He could see it in the way his peers had started to avoid him, in the whispers that followed him down the hallways. Rumors were spreading, painting him as a troublemaker, a liar, even an agitator. The narrative was shifting, and he was losing control of his own story. One afternoon, as Jamal and Maya were walking home, She suddenly stopped and grabbed his arm. "Look," she said, pointing to the bulletin board outside the local library. There, among the usual flyers for bake sales and lost pets, was a notice for a town hall meeting. The topic: Education and Inclusion in Westfield Schools. It was scheduled for the following week. "This is it," Maya said, her eyes lighting up. "This is our chance." "Our chance to do what?" Jamal asked, though he already knew the answer. "To tell your story, to let people know what's really happening." Jamal hesitated. The thought of standing up in front of a room full of adults, some of whom would undoubtedly disagree with him, made his stomach churn. But Maya was right. If he wanted to make a difference, he couldn't stay silent. "Okay," he said finally, "let's do it." The week leading up to the town hall was a blur of preparation. Jamal and Maya spent hours drafting a speech, pulling together evidence, and practicing in front of a mirror. But as the day drew closer, Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to go wrong. The threats, the isolation, the way the school seemed to be tightening its grip around him, it all felt like the calm before a storm. On the morning of the town hall, Jamal woke up to find an email sitting in his inbox. The subject line read, "Final warning." His hands trembled as he opened it, his eyes scanning the short, chilling message. "If you speak, there will be consequences." He stared at the screen, his heart pounding. Was this just another scare tactic, or was the threat real? And if it was, what kind of consequences were they talking about? Maya didn't flinch when he showed her the email later that day. "They're scared," she said simply. "That means we're doing something right." But Jamal wasn't so sure. As he stood in the packed town hall that evening, his palms slick with sweat and his speech crumpled in his hands, he couldn't help but wonder if he was making a mistake. The room was buzzing with chatter, the faces of parents, teachers, and students turned toward the podium at the front. Somewhere in the crowd, he spotted his parents, their expressions unreadable. Maya nudged him. "You ready?" He swallowed hard, nodding. "Yeah," he said, though he didn't feel ready at all. As his name was called, and he stepped up to the podium, the room fell silent. This was his moment. But just as he opened his mouth to speak, the doors at the back of the room burst open, and a figure stepped inside. All eyes turned toward the interruption, and a collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Jamal froze, his words forgotten. Whoever this person was, their presence changed everything, and Jamal had a sinking feeling that his fight was about to take a turn he couldn't predict. The room fell into a hush as the figure stepped through the doors, their heavy footsteps echoing against the polished floor. Jamal's grip tightened on the edges of the podium. He squinted under the harsh lights, trying to make out who it was, but his heart sank the moment he saw Principal Harris. The man's face was set in a grim expression, his presence exuding authority and a silent warning. He didn't belong here. This was a community event, not a school assembly. So why was he here now, just as Jamal was about to speak? "Sorry to interrupt," Principal Harris said smoothly, his voice cutting through the tense silence. "I just wanted to ensure that tonight's discussion remains productive and respectful. We're all here to listen, after all." He gave the crowd a tight, almost performative smile before leaning against the back wall, arms crossed. His eyes, however, never left Jamal. It wasn't hard to see what he was doing. He wasn't here to listen. He was here to remind Jamal of his place. Jamal's throat tightened as he turned back to face the crowd. His parents were still seated near the middle, their faces clouded with concern. Maya gave him a sharp nod from the sidelines, silently urging him on. He swallowed hard and finally began, his voice shaky at first, but growing steadier with each word. "I want to talk about what's really happening at Westfield High," he started. "Not just to me, but to other students who've been silenced or ignored. This isn't just about one project or one argument with a teacher. It's about a system that's designed to keep certain voices from being heard." As he spoke, he noticed the audience leaning in, their expressions a mix of curiosity and unease. He explained the backlash to his history project, the sudden scrutiny he'd faced from teachers, and the threatening messages he'd received. He talked about how the school's actions weren't just about discipline, they were about control. He could see some people nodding along, their faces showing flashes of understanding. But not everyone looked convinced. A few parents whispered to each other, their brows furrowed with skepticism. Jamal was just starting to feel like he might actually get through to them when someone stood up near the back of the room. It was Mrs. Carter. Her presence felt like a slap, and Jamal's stomach sank. He hadn't even noticed her come in. "Excuse me," she said, her voice firm but polished, as though she'd rehearsed this moment. "I think it's important to clarify a few things. As one of Jamal's teachers, I can say without hesitation that any actions taken against him have been entirely professional and within the bounds of school policy." Jamal felt his anger rise, but he forced himself to stay calm. Mrs. Carter wasn't done. Jamal's project, while well-intentioned, contained inaccuracies and controversial claims that weren't appropriate for a classroom setting, she continued. "We value all of our students, but it's our responsibility as educators to ensure that what's being presented aligns with the curriculum and fosters a positive learning environment." A murmur spread through the crowd. Jamal gripped the edges of the podium, his heart pounding. He knew this was a calculated move, a way to discredit him without outright saying he was lying. But before he could respond, another voice rang out. "That's not true," Maya said, stepping forward from her spot near the wall. Her voice was steady, her gaze unwavering as she stared Mrs. Carter down. "I helped Jamal with that project. Every fact was backed up by credible sources. You just didn't like what he was saying." The tension in the room skyrocketed. Principal Harris stepped forward then, holding up a hand as if to calm the crowd. "Let's not let this become personal," he said, though his sharp glare at Maya told a different story. "We're here to have a constructive dialogue." Jamal could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on him, waiting to see what he would do. His pulse raced as he looked out at the crowd, his voice cracking as he said, "This isn't about me being disrespectful or inaccurate. It's about the fact that you don't want students like me to challenge the way things are." For a moment, there was silence. Then, a voice from the middle of the room broke through. "Why would the school want to silence you?" a man asked, his tone skeptical. He was older, with a stern face and a deep voice that carried through the room. "What do they have to gain?" Jamal hesitated. He hadn't expected someone to question his motives so openly, and he wasn't sure how to answer without sounding defensive. But Maya jumped in before he could. "Because keeping things the same means keeping their power intact," she said bluntly. "If Jamal's project can challenge the way history is taught, what else can students question? Policies? Discipline? It's easier to shut someone down than to let them open that door." The man seemed to consider this, leaning back in his chair. But before anyone else could speak, the tension was interrupted by the faint sound of Jamal's phone buzzing in his pocket. He froze, the timing almost too eerie. Slowly, he pulled it out, glancing at the screen. It was another message, this time with no words, just a photo of him standing at the podium, taken from somewhere in the room. His blood ran cold. He shoved the phone back into his pocket, his hands trembling. Maya caught the look on his face, her expression darkening. "What is it?" she whispered. Jamal shook his head. "Nothing," he lied. He didn't want to make a scene, not now, not when everything was already teetering on the edge. But the photo was all he could think about as the discussion continued around him. Someone in that room was trying to intimidate him, and he had no idea who it was, or what they were planning. As the meeting wrapped up and people began filing out, Jamal stayed frozen in place, his mind racing. Principal Harris left without a word, his face unreadable. Mrs. Carter, however, made a point of walking past him, her eyes meeting his for a brief second. There was no warmth in her gaze, only something cold and unspoken. "You did good," Maya said as she came up beside him, but her voice was strained, and Jamal knew she could feel the same unease that had settled over him. As they stepped outside into the crisp evening air, Jamal's phone buzzed again. This time, the message was even shorter. "You're being watched." He stopped in his tracks, staring down at the screen, his chest tightening. Maya glanced over his shoulder, her face pale. "We need to figure out who's doing this," she said, "before it's too late." Jamal nodded, his jaw clenched. But deep down, he wasn't sure if they were running out of time, or if time had already run out. Jamal and Maya walked in tense silence, their breath visible in the cold night air. The streetlights cast long, flickering shadows on the pavement as they moved, the hum of distant traffic, the only sound breaking the stillness. Jamal couldn't stop glancing over his shoulder, every dark corner and passing car sending a chill up his spine. The messages weren't just threats anymore, they were proof that someone was watching, someone who was close enough to know his every move. The weight of that knowledge pressed heavily on his chest, and for the first time, he wondered if he had underestimated how far this would go. "We need to figure out who sent that picture," Maya said, her voice low but firm. She kept her eyes straight ahead, her pace quick and determined. "If we can figure that out, we can figure out who's behind all of this." Jamal didn't respond right away. His mind was spinning with possibilities, none of them good. Whoever had taken that photo had been in the town hall, close enough to him to get the angle just right. It could have been anyone. The skeptical parent, the school official sitting quietly in the back, even a student sent to spy on him. The paranoia was beginning to seep into his every thought, making him question everything and everyone around him. "Do you think it's Principal Harris?" Jamal finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Or maybe Mrs. Carter?" Maya frowned, shaking her head. "I don't know. Harris is slick, but this feels messier. He's more about intimidation through authority, not sneaking around. And Carter, she's too proud of herself. Whoever this is, they're staying hidden for a reason." The two turned down a quieter street, the neighborhood growing darker with every step. Maya slowed, glancing at Jamal. "We need to check your phone," she said suddenly. "There might be something we missed. Maybe the number, the metadata, something." Jamal hesitated, but handed over the device. Maya unlocked it, scrolling through the messages as they stopped under a dim streetlight. Her brows furrowed as she studied the photo and the texts. "This number isn't showing up in any searches," she muttered. "It's probably a burner phone." Jamal exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "Great. So whoever this is, they're careful." "Careful, but not invincible," Maya said, her voice taking on that determined edge again. "Everyone leaves a trail. We just have to find it." But finding that trail wasn't going to be easy, and they both knew it. Over the next few days, the tension only grew. Jamal kept his head down at school, but the feeling of being watched never left him. It wasn't just in the hallways anymore, it was everywhere. In the cafeteria, at practice, even in his own neighborhood. Once, as he walked home, he noticed a car idling at the end of his street. It stayed there until he stepped inside his house, the engine revving softly before it rolled away. Maya, meanwhile, was digging deeper than ever. She spent hours in the library, combing through old news articles and public records, trying to find any connection between the school's administration and the civil rights stories Jamal's project had unearthed. The deeper she went, the more tangled the web became. There were whispers of controversies long buried, lawsuits quietly settled, and a pattern of behavior that painted a chilling picture of how the school and its leaders handled dissent. One night, as they sat in Maya's living room, poring over a stack of documents she'd printed out, she suddenly slapped a hand on the table. "There," she said, pointing to an old newspaper clipping. "Look at this." Jamal leaned over, squinting at the headline, "Local activist pushes for school reform, faces backlash." The article was from decades ago, but the name in the piece made his heart skip a beat: Principal Harris. At the time, he had been an assistant principal at another school, one that had been embroiled in a fight over racial discrimination and unfair policies. According to the article, Harris had been accused of targeting students and staff who spoke out, using his position to quietly force them out of the school. "He's done this before," Maya said, her voice tight. "This is his playbook." Jamal stared at the page, his mind racing. So this isn't just about me. This is about control. He's done it before, and now he's doing it again. But why? Maya asked, her brow furrowed. Why would he go to such lengths to shut you down? What is he so afraid of? That was the question neither of them could answer. But as the days ticked by, it became clear that the stakes were even higher than they'd imagined. The messages kept coming, growing more cryptic and aggressive. One night, Jamal found a note slipped under his front door. It wasn't typed or printed this time. Someone had scrawled the words in messy handwriting. "Stop digging, or you'll regret it." He showed it to Maya the next day, and she immediately suggested going to the police. But Jamal shook his head. And say what? That someone's been sending me texts and left a creepy note. They won't do anything until something happens. That's exactly what I'm afraid of, Maya said, her voice trembling for the first time since this started. What if something does happen, Jamal? What if? It won't, he said, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. I'm not stopping. I can't. The breaking point came later that week. Jamal was sitting in class, trying to focus on a math quiz, when his phone buzzed in his pocket. He ignored it at first, but it buzzed again, then again. Finally, as the teacher turned to write on the board, he slipped the phone out, shielding the screen with his hand. The message was a single image, but it made his blood run cold. It was a photo of his house, taken from the street, the front door wide open. He shot out of his chair, his heart pounding. The teacher spun around, startled. "Jamal, where are you going?" I need to go," he stammered, already grabbing his bag and heading for the door. He didn't stop to explain, didn't stop to think. All he could see was that image burned into his mind, the open door, the implication that someone had been there. He called Maya as he ran through the parking lot, his voice shaking as he explained what had happened. "I'm going home," he said. "I have to make sure." "I'm coming with you," she interrupted. "Wait for me. I'll meet you there." But Jamal didn't wait. His feet pounded against the pavement as he raced through the streets, his mind spinning with worst-case scenarios. What if someone was still there? What if his parents had come home early-hand? He reached his house, skidding to a stop in the driveway. The door was closed now, but that didn't reassure him. His hands trembled as he reached for the doorknob, pushing it open cautiously. "Hello," he called out, his voice echoing through the empty house. There was no response. The rooms were just as he'd left them that morning, quiet, untouched. But as he stepped into the living room, his heart stopped. On the coffee table sat a folder, the kind you'd find in an office, its surface clean except for 2 words written in thick black marker. "Stay silent." Jamal stared at it, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. Whoever had been here didn't just want to scare him. They wanted to make it clear they could reach him anywhere. His home, his safe space, had been invaded. He felt exposed, vulnerable, and more alone than ever. As the front door creaked open behind him, Jamal spun around, his fists clenched. But it was only Maya, her face pale as she stepped inside. She took one look at the folder and froze. "They're escalating," she whispered. "This isn't just about intimidation anymore. They're trying to break you." Jamal nodded, his jaw tight. It's not going to work. But even as he said the words, he wasn't sure if they were true. Jamal stared at the folder, his heartbeat drumming in his ears. His mind churned with questions: who had been in his house, how they had gotten inside, and what could be inside that folder. He reached out hesitantly, his fingers trembling as they brushed the edge. Maya stood beside him, her sharp intake of breath the only sound in the room. "Wait," she said, placing a hand on his arm. "We don't know what's in there. What if it's something dangerous?" Jamal glanced at her, his expression hard. "We don't have a choice. They came here, to my home. I need to know what they're trying to tell me." Slowly, he flipped the folder open. Inside were a series of grainy photocopies and photographs, some official-looking and others clearly candid. The first was a copy of his project's title page, but with angry red ink slashed across it, reading, Know your limits. Beneath it, there were photos of Jamal in various places, walking into school, sitting in the library, leaving the town hall meeting. Each was marked with the same ominous scrawl, "Stay silent." But what caught Jamal's eye most was the document beneath the photos. It was a school memo, marked confidential with Principal Harris' name at the top. The subject line read, "Proposed measures for dissenting students." As Jamal read the first few lines, his stomach dropped. It outlined steps for monitoring students deemed disruptive to the school's environment, including methods of documenting their activities and reporting them to authorities if necessary. It was clear Harris wasn't just retaliating against Jamal, he had a system in place to suppress anyone who challenged the status quo. "This is bigger than I thought," Jamal muttered, his voice tight with anger. "He's been doing this for years, hasn't he? Not just to me, but to anyone who tries to speak up." Maya leaned over his shoulder, her eyes scanning the memo. "It's like he's running his own private surveillance operation. But how did you get this? And why would they leave it here for you to find?" "That's what I don't understand," Jamal said, shaking his head. "If this is Harris or someone working with him, why expose themselves like this?" Maya's expression darkened. "What if it's not them? What if someone else is trying to warn you?" The thought sent a shiver down Jamal's spine. He had been so focused on the threats that he hadn't considered the possibility that someone inside the system might be trying to help him. But if that was true, why not just come forward? Why resort to cryptic notes and secret deliveries? Before they could delve further, Jamal's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out quickly, his pulse spiking when he saw another message. This one was different. No photos, no threats, just an address and a time. 9 p.m. tonight. Come alone. Maya leaned over, reading the message. "This has to be connected," she said. "Whoever sent it might be the person who left the folder." "Or it could be a trap," Jamal said, his voice low. "I'm not going anywhere without knowing who's on the other end of this." Maya nodded. "Then we figure it out before you go, if you go." The hours until 9 p.m. felt like a lifetime. Maya worked tirelessly, cross-referencing the address with everything she could find online. It led to an old, abandoned building on the outskirts of town, a place that used to be a community center before it was shut down years ago. Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking straight into danger, but he also knew that turning back now wasn't an option. As the clock crept closer to 9, Jamal stood in front of the mirror in his room, staring at his reflection. His face was pale, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion and stress. He'd been pushed further than he thought possible, and yet he wasn't broken. He wouldn't let himself be. When the time came, Maya insisted on driving him, despite the warning to come alone. "I'll stay out of sight," she promised. "But I'm not letting you go in there without backup." Jamal didn't argue. He was too tired to fight her on this, and deep down, he was grateful for her presence. As they pulled up to the building, the scene was as eerie as he'd expected. The structure loomed in the darkness, its windows boarded up and the faint sound of wind whistling through the cracks. The streetlights nearby flickered weakly, casting long, shifting shadows across the empty parking lot. "This is where horror movies start," Maya muttered, gripping the steering wheel tightly. "Be careful in there." Jamal nodded, taking a deep breath before stepping out of the car. His footsteps echoed against the cracked pavement as he approached the entrance. The door was ajar, creaking slightly as he pushed it open. Inside, the air was cold and stale, the faint scent of mildew hanging in the air. He took a few cautious steps forward, his eyes scanning the darkness. "Hello," he called out, his voice trembling slightly. "I'm here." For a moment, there was no response. Then, a figure emerged from the shadows, their face obscured by a hood. Jamal's heart leaped into his throat, but he forced himself to stand his ground. "You're brave to come," the person said, their voice low and measured. "But bravery only gets you so far." "Who are you?" Jamal demanded. "And why are you doing this?" The figure pulled back their hood, revealing a face Jamal didn't recognize. A young man, maybe in his mid-20s, with sharp features and piercing eyes. "My name doesn't matter," he said. "What matters is that you understand what you're up against." He held out a flash drive, its metallic surface gleaming faintly in the dim light. "Everything you need to expose the truth is on here. Records, emails, documents. Harris has been covering up more than you realize." Jamal hesitated, staring at the drive. "Why are you helping me?" The man's expression hardened. "Because I've seen what happens when people like Harris go unchecked. He ruined my brother's life years ago, forced him out of school, destroyed his future. I couldn't stop it then, but I can stop it now, with your help." Jamal reached out to take the drive, his hand shaking slightly. But before he could say anything else, the man stiffened, his eyes darting toward the door. "You need to go, now." "What? Why?" "There's no time." The man hissed, shoving the drive into Jamal's hand. "They're coming." Jamal's pulse spiked as the sound of footsteps echoed from outside. He turned, catching a glimpse of flashlights sweeping across the parking lot. Panic surged through him as he realized they weren't alone. Someone had followed him. Jamal's heart raced as the flashlights flickered closer, casting long, wavering beams of light into the dark building. He clutched the flash drive tightly, his fingers damp with sweat. The man who had handed it to him darted back into the shadows without another word, leaving Jamal alone to face whatever was coming. "Jamal." Maya's voice cut through the tense silence, faint but urgent from the direction of the car. He turned, his mind screaming at him to run, but his legs felt rooted to the spot. The crunch of boots on gravel grew louder, and then a familiar voice called out, "Mr. Daniels, you're out late." It was Principal Harris, stepping into view. The sharp beam of his flashlight landed on Jamal's face, making him squint. Behind Harris stood two other men, likely security or accomplices, their faces unreadable in the dim light. Jamal forced himself to stand tall, even though his insides were trembling. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice steadier than he expected. "Following me now. Is that part of your plan?" Harris' lips curled into a tight smile, but there was no warmth in it. "You've been making quite a bit of noise, young man, and now you're sneaking around in abandoned buildings. Not exactly the behavior of a model student." Jamal gripped the flash drive harder, careful to keep it out of view. "What are you so afraid of?" he shot back. "That people might find out the truth about you, about this school." Harris stepped closer, his expression darkening. "You don't know what you're playing with, Jamal. Some things are better left alone, for your own good." Jamal's jaw tightened, his fear giving way to anger. "For your good, you mean? You don't want anyone to see what you've done, how you've silenced people, hurt them, ruined their lives. Well, I'm not stopping. You can threaten me all you want, but I won't back down." For a moment, Harris said nothing. The tension in the air was suffocating. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a phone. He tapped the screen, and a photo appeared, a picture of Maya sitting in her car, waiting outside. "Bravery is admirable, Jamal," Harris said quietly, "but recklessness, that can get people hurt. You might want to think about who else you're putting at risk." Jamal's stomach twisted. The threat was clear, and it made his blood boil. "You don't scare me," he said through clenched teeth, though his voice betrayed a flicker of doubt. But before Harris could respond, there was a loud, piercing sound, a car horn blaring. The flashlights whipped toward the source, and Jamal took the opportunity to bolt. He sprinted toward the exit, his feet pounding against the concrete floor, adrenaline propelling him forward. Behind him, Harris shouted something, but Jamal didn't stop to listen. As he burst out into the night, he saw Maya's car barreling toward the building, her headlights cutting through the darkness. She skidded to a stop, throwing the passenger door open. "Get in," she yelled. Jamal dove into the seat just as Harris and the other men emerged from the building. Maya slammed her foot on the gas, the tires screeching as they sped away. Jamal twisted in his seat to look back, his chest heaving. Harris stood there watching them go, his expression cold and calculating. "You okay?" Maya asked, her voice tight with worry. "Yeah," Jamal said, though he wasn't sure if it was true. He held up the flash drive. "I got this. It's everything we need to expose him." Maya's eyes flicked to the drive, then back to the road. "Good, because we're going straight to the media." But it wasn't that simple. As they reached the edge of town, Jamal's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a video file. He opened it hesitantly, and what he saw made his blood run cold. It was security footage from inside the school, specifically of him and Maya in the library weeks ago, discussing the project. The audio was faint, but clear enough to hear snippets of their conversation, including Jamal's frustration with Harris. "They've been watching us this whole time," Jamal said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They were waiting for me to mess up." Maya frowned, her grip tightening on the steering wheel. "So what? They want to scare us into giving up. That's not happening. We have the proof now." Jamal nodded, but a nagging doubt crept into his mind. Why had the man who gave him the flash drive been so adamant about him leaving quickly? Why had he warned him that someone was coming? And why had Harris been so confident, even when Jamal had what he thought was the upper hand? They pulled into Maya's driveway, the house dark and quiet. Inside, they immediately plugged the flash drive into Maya's laptop, the screen glowing in the dim room. The files were extensive: emails between Harris and school board members, transcripts of meetings, reports on students who had been targeted. It was a treasure trove of evidence, enough to take Harris down. But as Jamal scrolled through the files, his stomach dropped. Buried among the documents was another folder labeled Incident Reports. He clicked it open, and his own name was the first to appear. The file contained everything, from his attendance records to notes on his behavior, even transcripts of private conversations with teachers. It painted him as a troublemaker, someone prone to outbursts and defiance. "This is how they're going to spin it," Jamal said, his voice hollow. "They're going to use this to discredit me, to make it look like I'm lying or trying to cause trouble." Maya leaned over his shoulder, her jaw tight. "We'll get ahead of it. We'll release everything at once. The evidence against Harris, the documents they have on you. They won't be able to cover it up." But just as she spoke, another notification popped up on the screen. It was a message, sent to the same encrypted folder as the files. The sender's name was obscured, but the message was chillingly clear. "Careful who you trust. Not everyone is on your side." Jamal and Maya exchanged a look, the weight of the warning sinking in. Someone had helped them, but someone else was still watching, still trying to pull the strings. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, and as much as they wanted to believe they were in control, the truth was clear. The game was far from finished. Jamal leaned back in his chair, staring at the message on the screen. "Careful who you trust." The words echoed in his mind, twisting everything that had just happened. He couldn't shake the uneasy feeling creeping over him. The flash drive was a powerful weapon, but it had also made him a target. Someone wanted him to have this information, but someone else, maybe Harris or even someone higher up, was still trying to control the narrative. Maya broke the silence. "We have to act fast. If we sit on this too long, they'll spin it against you. Harris already knows we're onto him." Jamal nodded slowly. "You're right. But this message," he tapped the screen. "Whoever sent it, are they trying to help us or warn us off?" "Does it matter?" Maya asked. "At the end of the day, this is about the truth. Harris needs to be held accountable. The system that allowed him to get this far, it needs to be exposed." Her words gave Jamal a sense of clarity. He had started this journey because he believed in something bigger than himself, the idea that justice could prevail, even in a world where the odds seemed stacked against it. This wasn't just about Harris anymore. It was about standing up for every student who had been silenced, for every voice that had been ignored. The next morning, Jamal and Maya decided to take the evidence to a local journalist who had a reputation for exposing corruption. Her name was Andrea Collins, and she had covered stories of injustice in the community for years. They met her at a quiet cafe, far enough from school to avoid any familiar faces. Andre listened intently as Jamal laid out the story. He showed her the flash drive, the threats he had received, and even the file Harris had compiled on him. "This is explosive," Andrea said, her voice low, but charged with urgency. "If we release this, it's not just Harris who'll be under fire. The entire school board might be implicated." Jamal swallowed hard. "Good. They've been covering for him for too long." Andre's expression softened. "I admire your courage, Jamal, but you need to understand, once this goes public, your life will change. They'll come after you even harder. Are you ready for that?" Jamal hesitated. He thought about his parents, the stress this would put on them. He thought about Maya, who had been dragged into this fight because of her loyalty to him. Most of all, he thought about the students who still believed in him, who were counting on him to do the right thing. "I'm ready," he said finally. "This isn't just about me. It's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." Andrea nodded, a look of respect in her eyes. "Then let's get to work." Over the next few days, Andre's team meticulously went through the evidence, corroborating the details and cross-checking the documents. Jamal and Maya stayed in close contact with her, providing context and answering questions. The process was exhausting, but it also felt empowering. For the first time, Jamal felt like he had real allies in this fight. When the story broke, it hit the community like a thunderclap. Andre's article laid everything bare: the surveillance, the retaliation against students, the toxic culture that Harris had cultivated. News outlets picked up the story, and social media exploded with outrage. Parents demanded answers. Former students came forward with their own stories of mistreatment under Harris' leadership. The school board announced an emergency meeting to address the allegations. Harris, of course, denied everything. He called the accusations baseless and painted himself as the victim of a smear campaign. But the evidence was too overwhelming to dismiss. The leaked documents, the emails, and the testimonies from students and staff left little room for doubt. Within a week, Harris was placed on administrative leave pending an investigation. For Jamal, the fallout was a whirlwind. He was hailed as a hero by some, while others accused him of trying to tear the school apart. He received messages of support from across the country, but also faced backlash from Harris supporters. Through it all, Maya remained by his side, her unwavering belief in him keeping him grounded. One evening, as Jamal sat in his room scrolling through the endless stream of news coverage, his phone buzzed. It was a call from a number he didn't recognize. He hesitated, then answered. "Hello, Jamal, it's me," said the voice on the other end. It was the man from the abandoned building, the one who had given him the flash drive. Jamal sat up straight. "Why are you calling now? Who are you?" The man sighed. "You've done well, Jamal. Better than I expected, but you're not finished yet." "What do you mean?" Jamal asked, his voice tinged with frustration. "Harris is out. The truth is out. What else is there?" "There's always more," the man said cryptically. Harris was just one piece of the puzzle. The system that allowed him to thrive is still intact. If you really want change, you can't stop now. Jamal's grip on the phone tightened. "Why don't you just tell me who you are? Why are you helping me?" The man paused. "Let's just say I know what it's like to be where you are, to feel like the whole world is against you. You're doing what I couldn't. Keep going." Before Jamal could respond, the line went dead. He stared at the phone, his mind racing. The man was right. The fight wasn't over. But for now, Jamal felt a sense of peace. He had taken the first step, and that was what mattered. In the weeks that followed, the school began to change. A new interim principal was appointed, one who promised to rebuild trust with the students and staff. The school board launched a review of its policies, vowing to address the issues that had been exposed. Jamal's classmates, inspired by his bravery, started speaking out about other problems they have faced. Slowly but surely, the culture of fear and silence began to shift. One afternoon, Jamal and Maya sat on the bleachers outside the school, watching as students milled around the courtyard. The air felt lighter somehow, as if a weight had been lifted. "You did it," Maya said, nudging him with her elbow. "You really did it." Jamal smiled, though he knew there was still work to be done. "We did it," he corrected. "I couldn't have done this without you." Maya grinned. "Don't get all sentimental on me now. We've got a reputation to uphold." Jamal laughed, the sound genuine and unburdened. For the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself to breathe. The road ahead would be tough, but he was ready for it. He had found his voice, and no one could take that away from him. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the school in a warm golden glow, Jamal felt a quiet sense of victory. He had fought for what was right, and though the journey was far from over, he knew he was on the right path. For the first time, he truly believed that change was possible, and that was enough.